And we are live and on the internet, on Facebook here, or YouTube if you're watching this on YouTube. Um, Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be with all of you on this Thursday afternoon. My name is John Lustrea. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And with me today, we got Moyra Schauffler. Is that right?
That's correct.
Oh, thank heavens. I asked you beforehand and my memory is so bad, I immediately forgot and I apologize, but I got there in the end. So thank you for being with us here, Moyra. And if you're watching, we've got a real treat in store for you. We're going to be talking about 19th century prosthetic limbs, including one that we have in our very own collection at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We'll get to all that in just a little bit. Go ahead and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. I see we got Barbara from New Jersey, always one of the first people to chime in. It's great to see you're watching, Barbara. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And as people start tuning in here, be sure and like the video if you can. That helps us a ton, helps spread our reach, have more people stumble across the video. That's great. And share the video if you can. Either send it to friends you know will find this interesting, or just share it to your page in general. Helps spread the reach, gets us more views, more people to tune in, and that helps us all immensely. So if you can do that, if you want to help out the museum, that's a great way that you can do that. Just like the video, share the video, and all that. See, we got Gwendolyn tuning in from our very own Frederick, Maryland. Let's see, Laureline from Yakima, Washington. Robert, a member from Claremont, Florida. Thank you, Robert, for becoming a member to the museum. I know you've been a faithful viewer with a lot of these videos that we've done. We really appreciate that. And something I'll mention, if you are a member of the museum, which I'd encourage you to become, you get access to our journal that gets put out. It's called The Surgeon's Call, and that's actually how Moyra comes to be with us today. She wrote a wonderful article in the most recent Surgeon's Call. So if you enjoy what you hear today, you might want to consider signing up to become a member so you can get access to the Surgeon's Call articles that get put out in our journal. So I'm sure Robert can and other members can tune in the comments and tell you how excellent the journal is. So that's part of our reason for being here today. We got more people tuning in. Gary from Ellicott City, Maryland. Stephen from Hastings, Florida. Mary from New Jersey. Richard from Bridgeport, West Virginia. Nancy from Baraboo, Wisconsin. Let's see, Sue from Columbia, Georgia, perhaps, or maybe just George. Anyway, lots of people tuning in. It's great to be with you all on this Thursday. Again, I'm John Lustrea, Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, joined by Moyra Schauffler today. And one final note before we jump in, our fundraising campaign, our Hope Through History campaign, we're rapidly closing in. We have less than $1,000 to go to reach our goal of $25,000. And so if you want to help out the museum, if you've enjoyed these videos that we have done all through the pandemic, consider donating to that. That money goes directly towards us recouping some of the lost revenue that we didn't intake as a result of the pandemic. And we've been overwhelmed by your generosity, so close to our goal. So if you enjoy this video, you've enjoyed other videos, maybe consider making a donation, even as small as $10, $15 helps us out immensely. Like I said, we're under $1,000 to go to get to our goal. So thank you for that, and give if you can, and if not, like and share the video. And with all that said, we'll go ahead and dive in to what we're talking about here today. Again, Moyra comes to us because she wrote an excellent article for our most recent Surgeon's Call, a benefit that you get if you sign up to become a member of the museum. So Moyra, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do in the world of history, how you got into history, and then how you came to write this article about 19th century prosthetic limbs.
Sure. So I'm a first year PhD student at Penn State University. My research focuses on 19th century veterans with a specific emphasis on Civil War era veterans welfare. But critical to my work on veterans' homes and prosthetic limbs is material culture, or the study of objects. I approached these forms of welfare by considering how spaces were organized physically, and the materiality of objects involved in providing veterans with care after the Civil War, but at other points in the 19th century as well. Before coming to Penn State, I completed my Master of Arts in History at Villanova University, and that's where I researched and wrote this paper that ultimately became the article in Surgeon's Call. And it's wonderful to be with the museum today. I'm originally from Maryland. And I was telling John before we got started that as an APUS student in high school, I wrote my first serious research paper on Civil War medicine, and it required a visit to the museum. And so I really love to be here today, and it feels a little bit like coming full circle after that visit many years ago. So that's a little bit about how I where I'm coming from, what my interests are academically, and then in terms of the paper, like I said, I wrote this as part of a seminar at Villanova, and the seminar was focused on material culture methods. So sort of teaching and discussing how historians use objects as sources, just as historians use use documents and other types of written sources, they can use objects as well. And so this article began as a semester-long project, and the assignment was to choose one object and then build a research paper around it. And so I use material analysis in the paper to make the argument that 19th century prosthetic limbs were crafted to look like natural replacements for the real limbs that people lost. And it's important, this is an important distinction, because scholars before have argued that these were natural replacements and meant for public viewing, so making a person look real, look like they had a real limb, so that they could be members of society just as people with whole functioning bodies could. But when I looked closely at the leg at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine and other objects or other limbs, I noticed that materially they included elements that could not have been seen by public viewers. And so these are things like functionally irrelevant ankle bones or calf muscles or fingernails that wouldn't have been seen by someone viewing this person walking or moving down the street, that it was for the wearer themselves. So that's an important piece of the argument that I make in the paper. But then additionally, I also argue for an expanded consideration of 19th century artificial limbs outside the traditional context of the Civil War and its aftermath. So for obvious reasons, amputation and prosthetic limbs are mostly associated with the Civil War because of, so many soldiers experienced this operation and got limbs after the war. But prosthetic limbs existed before the war as well. And so when we think about, who was using a prosthetic limb in the 19th century, I think we need to look beyond the Civil War. And so that's another piece of the argument that I make in the paper.
A lot of great stuff to unpack in there, and we're going to touch on all those things as we go throughout here. But love having things come full circle. Glad that the museum served, at least in a small way, as an inspiration for you on your career. We love to hear that. We've got some people in the comments saying that they read the article. Derek said he read the entire article and presumably he enjoyed it. So we got some fans tuning in the comments. And I should note, I didn't say this earlier, if you have any questions throughout the program, please drop them in the comments and we'll try and get to them. We got Ryan, another one of our members who enjoyed the article in the magazine. So you out there, if you're not a member, now's a great time to sign up. It helps out the museum and you get some fantastic content, as some of our unpaid testimonials in the comments are suggesting. There's a link to become a member in the comments. as well as I forgot to mention earlier, a link to our fundraising campaign in there as well. So let me see here. So yeah, you mentioned you focus on veteran studies. There's a lot of great work being done currently on that. Earlier this year, we had, or well, last year, I should say, we had Sarah Hanley Cousins on. She had a book come out recently, Bodies in Blue. You can go check that one out, which is on our YouTube channel and Facebook page if that's of interest to you. But I want to talk about material culture here, which is, as you mentioned, a specialty of yours. It's seemingly kind of a no-brainer. I think as historians can trick ourselves into the idea that, documentary evidence, written words are the best and maybe even the only way to access the past. Maybe talk about, why this is maybe like so easy for us to miss looking at objects and what approaches you take in how to glean information. You mentioned you came to the museum to look at one of the pieces in our collection. We'll get to that, but you mentioned you had a few 2-hour appointments. What kind of notes are you taking? What are you looking for when you do this?
Absolutely. So, and I think, like you say, it's a little bit obvious that objects could be important sources to historians. I think objects are the types of historical sources the public comes in contact with most when they visit museums. You're looking at objects. Sometimes you see documents, but it's objects that you see. And ironically, objects have kind of slowly been added to the sort of repertoire of historians, or the toolbox of historians, looking at all aspects of history, not just 19th century U.S. history, but sort of widely. And it was sort of since the 1980s, material culture has grown as both a field and a method. And there's some debate of whether it's a field, whether it's a method. But I think analysis of objects in historical research still does lag behind the preference for documentary sources. And so, in my case, in reading histories of the Civil War, I had to look at a lot of literature on prosthetic limbs. I found that a lot of historians have talked about these limbs as natural replacements, as examples of technological innovation. But they use written sources and they use visual culture. So these are images that appear in magazines like Harper's Weekly that show amputee veterans or show prosthetic limbs. And those are great, but there's something to be said, I think, for the object itself, and that you can learn even more that makes those examples of prosthetic limbs and documentary sources or visual sources that much more meaningful when you look at the objects themselves. And so thinking about things like size, weight, color, construction of artificial limbs in this case, but any object really, without doing that, you overlook a critical piece of evidence, I think. So in terms of process, like you mentioned, I visited the museum twice to conduct research on the particular leg at the center of the article. And the first visit I did about 2 years ago at the end of January or so, maybe beginning of February. And I intentionally went to that visit without doing research prior to it and without really looking into artificial limbs specifically. I had some background knowledge. I knew, I'd studied veterans' homes. I knew that there were, welfare programs that provided limbs to amputee veterans, but that was really the extent to which I knew about these things. So I went and I really let the object speak for itself. So I spent 2 hours sketching and taking notes and really sort of looking at the details. How is this object made? How was it used? What was it for? And it was from there that I took away that it had to have been for a below the knee amputation, for instance, right? That the way that it was constructed was couldn't have been for something above the knee, for instance. And so I really let the object guide me, as opposed to, I approached the project as someone interested in veterans and thought in my mind that's kind of the direction I would go. But this leg had no identifiable markings that told me the manufacturer, that told me the date, that told me the owner. So I couldn't just write about Civil War veterans because I wanted to. I had to let the object speak for itself, and that's how I got on this track of the leg as a commodity, the leg as a object of disability, and that took me away from my comfort zone of Civil War and Civil War veterans, and into this broader context of 19th century history. Then for the second visit that I made to the museum, I did a bunch of research. So I walked away from the first visit and had a lot of different questions, tried to figure out, what other kinds of limbs were available in the 19th century? How does this one compare to limbs that show up in patents, of like images of patents and descriptions of them, or in advertising literature? Can I find this particular model? That was one thing I tried to do. I was ultimately unsuccessful there, but it didn't really matter that I was unsuccessful. I mean, it would have been great, but I was still able to pull a lot of rich details. So then for my second visit, I looked at the sketches from my first visit, and I kind of went in with a plan of what I was looking for. And that's when I had started to zero in on this idea that perhaps elements of this leg were meant for the wearer and not just the public. And so I paid closer attention to details like the ankle bone, or the carved calf muscle, or the intentional sort of material of the leather lacer. That was a soft material that would have been more comfortable than something of a harder texture or something like that. So that's how I approached that second visit. And material culturalists call this close looking. So just like a historian would close read a document, objects can be closely read. And I think that's really the difference between material culture and using material analysis. That's the difference between that and just incorporating objects into the narrative. So you can talk about objects, right? But if you're not looking at the size, the weight, the construction, thinking about, another method that I talk a little bit about in the paper is the life cycle. So thinking about the material that constructed this object, and then how it became a prosthetic limb, and then the context in which it exists in the museum, right? That's a new context. It went from a object for a disabled person. It went from a commodity, it changed context. And then now it sits in a collection that is dedicated to studying the Civil War and its medical history. And so those are all different things. And I think when you place the object at the center of your research, you can discover new contexts in which the object exists, but also sort of round them out and explain them in ways that you can't do with just documentary sources.
The idea of close looking akin to close reading, I love that. That's I think a really great way to look at it. And I also think that's a very clever idea, going in the first time with little background and just kind of seeing what jumps out to you. It's a really interesting idea. And your point for really kind of a close looking, looking at the material, how heavy it might be, thinking about all that sort of stuff, noticing slight ridges and things like that. It just it's a reminder about how important it is to see these things up close, and a reminder for how important museums are, not just to toot our own horn, although I'm happy to do that, not just to toot our own horn. The pandemic has led to a lot of developments and interesting things like this. Zoom conversations, we're talking from multiple states away, and that's awesome. Things are more accessible than ever, it seems. But when things get back to normal one day, I think there will be a piece of I think everyone that says, well, do I really need to go out to these places anymore? I mean, there's so much that's accessible. But I think you're making a really compelling case for why it's important to go see these things. There's really no substitute for being there.
Absolutely. And I think, a lot of, because of the pandemic, a lot of documentary sources are being digitized, and that's wonderful. I'm able to do a lot of research that would not have been possible without that digitization. But it is, again, there's something to be said for holding a document even, or holding the object, that is so important to understanding, how it might have been used and how it might have been, thought about in the past.
And we have at least one person in the comments who agrees with us. Denise is saying, I find objects create a visual context that no amount of document research can shape in my mind. Objects help me to break the subtle assumptions that my mind creates, which are shaped by my limited knowledge paired with automatic assumptions. Well put, Denise, appreciate that. We got a question in the comments here from Barbara, who's going to take us in a little bit different of a direction. She asks, wondering if the statement in Burns' Civil War, I'm a bad Civil War historian. I've never seen the Ken Burns Civil War series.
Been a while, me too.
She says, wondering if the statement in Burns' Civil War that 1/6 of the Mississippi state budget was spent on prosthetic limbs after the war. In 1866, I believe that was indeed the case. And you mentioned, some of the welfare programs that existed for both, funded by the federal government or some of the former Confederate states. And, you can talk about those if you want, but this question leads me to a question that I think is interesting, that since I work at a Civil War medical museum, I've never thought to ask, is that, do we place too much emphasis on the Civil War as a source for prosthetic limbs? No doubt many came from the Civil War. There's no questioning that. But as you mentioned earlier, they existed before the Civil War. So talk about all that. You can talk about the welfare programs a little if you want, but then get into the second part of the question there.
Yeah, so I'll start with the welfare programs, and I can make a couple of recommendations for books that talk even more in depth about them, because I'm certainly not an expert on those. But for the welfare programs, like pensions, these there was a difference between Union and Confederate programs for artificial limbs. So the programs for Union veterans were funded by the federal government, and that began during the war and continued after. On the Confederate side, there was no federal funding for Confederate veterans to obtain limbs, just as there was no federal funding for Confederate veterans to get pensions. And so it started with private relief organizations that started to obtain limbs and get them to Confederate veterans, and then states began to appropriate funds that helped these veterans get the limbs. And so there's certainly a difference there, right? And understandably, for 19th century people, certainly the federal government wouldn't have wanted to provide veterans whom they saw as treasonous, get federal benefits. But then there's still this idea that that the government or at least a state government should pay for an object that would help a veteran recover from their injury. So that's certainly, when we think about like how prosthetic limbs changed over the course of the Civil War, that expansion of welfare is a really important piece of it. And Guy Hasegawa talks about this in his book, Mending Broken Soldiers. And it's specifically about the Union and Confederate programs to supply artificial limbs. And so that would be a good place to go and look at specific details about, what kinds of limbs Union veterans were provided, and what kinds of limbs Confederate veterans were provided, because different manufacturers were assigned to each side. So
and I'll just interject briefly here. Guy Hasegawa, former board member for the museum, and we of course sell the very book that you mentioned in our bookshop. So when we're currently closed to the public now, but when we do open back up and you all come back in, you can pick that book up from us at the museum.
Yep, and Brian Craig Miller also talks about the Southern programs in his book, Empty Sleeves. So that would be another place to look for information on those.
And I'll also interject, we had Brian Craig Miller on a previous one of our videos, so if that's of interest, you can go check that one back out, one of the previous ones we did.
Right, I promise I'm not naming these people on purpose.
You're doing a great job. You're setting me up perfectly there.
Um, so yeah, so I mean, the second part of your question, which was about, do we place too much emphasis on the Civil War? I think it's a really interesting one. I want to be clear, and I clearly state this in the article. I don't actually think that the particular leg in the collection belonged to a Civil War veteran. It's speculation, but based on my research, I think it's an earlier model, and it's possible, but the idea that a soldier serving in the Battle of Monocacy would have left a fully intact prosthetic limb doesn't really make sense. There were certainly veterans who did wear prosthetic limbs in battle. I know of one officer whose limb was destroyed when he was re-injured. And so it would make sense if a destroyed prosthetic limb was left, but a fully intact one, I think, is not quite, that doesn't quite fit. And then it's just as likely that it could have been an amputee who had a farming accident or an industrial accident, some kind of other event that required them needing a prosthetic leg. But that's not to say that the leg doesn't belong in the collection. And I think that's really important. I mean, it was found locally. Prosthetic limbs are an important part of Civil War medical history, and so I do not advocate for the leg to be out of the collection for any reason, but I think it is really indicative of the way that historians have approached prosthetic limbs in the 19th century, which is to place the war at the center of those discussions. And it's because of scale, right? The war made the prosthetic industry grow exponentially. But what happens when we place the war at the center is that the developments in that industry that happened earlier in the 19th century become overshadowed, or at least sort of just part of the story that led to the Civil War. That it was sort of this, preceding chapter of prosthetic limb history that ultimately led to this great expansion during the Civil War. And so I think that's, we lose this commodity history, right? If we just focus on the war, that this is an industry that grew and sold and designed limbs that had very specific purposes. But then also when we think of soldiers as the only ones wearing prosthetic limbs, we lose women, for example, who did wear prosthetic limbs, right? There are, in advertising literature, there's examples of women who are drawn to be wearing prosthetic limbs, and limbs designed for women in particular. So when we just talk about the war, we lose another population of amputees, and the sources that tell us these things kind of lose their place, if that makes sense. So I think that that's one way to sort of advocate for expanding the way that we look at artificial limbs throughout the 19th century that's just beyond the war. And I'm certainly not the only one to advocate for this. There's a book that was recently published. It's an edited volume by Claire Jones called Rethinking Modern Prostheses in Anglo-American Commodity Cultures. And she looks at the years between 1820 and 1939. So if you're interested in sort of looking at prosthetic limbs beyond the Civil War, that book might be a good option. And there's also other scholars who look at prostheses that are divorced from the Civil War.
It's such a brilliant but simple point that, when we think about prosthetic limbs in the 19th century, and, I am biased since I work at a Civil War medical museum, so I'm certainly not, the everyman in this case, but I, of course, tend to think about them in the Civil War context. But, of course, you presumably would have had to have an amputation, to go shopping for these sorts of things. But, these are commodities that anyone can go out and buy for, whatever reason. Presumably, it would be useful to someone who buys it. But, these are commodities that you can go out and buy. And, which puts it in a different experience of like, suddenly, this is just being handed to me because I lost a limb in the war and now here I am. And it's hard to know exactly how common or uncommon relative to each other those experiences were, but I think the non-Civil War experience can get lost amidst the, the primacy of the Civil War experience. So I think it's a great point, and I love that you make it there. Let me see here. Talk about some of the actual advances. So you mentioned the industry grows exponentially. So what sort of advances did come in the prosthetic limb industry during the war, or even before the war, leading up to it? Talk about how that industry grew and changed over the course of the 19th century. I know that's a big question, but take it wherever you want to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think starting with the 19th century broadly, the developments of Western industrialization and urbanization are really important to the prosthesis industry. Like we've stated, prosthetic limbs existed before the 19th century. There's evidence of some kinds of prostheses that go as far back as antiquity. So these are not new objects, but when you get the rise of Western industrialization and urbanization, where more people are coming into contact with more people than they ever had before, both the types of objects and things that are made and beliefs about people and populations change. And so in the West, or in the United States specifically, what happens is that simultaneously with the growth of, with changes in, mechanical innovation and those types of things, we get spreading beliefs that physical difference of a person has is poorly reflective on their character, right? So when you have more people coming into contact with one another in urban areas, that belief about the relationship between appearance and morality spreads to greater pieces of the population. And so the way that translates to prostheses is that they are made to disguise those differences, and they're made to make a person move like and look like they have a real limb. And so we start to see things, and this is evidence in the leg that is in the collection at the museum, where you have braces that would have braced the knee and allowed, and there was some movement that was possible in, like, as the braces sort of connected to one another. And so the person could have a more natural gait than they would have otherwise. This leg would have allowed someone to wear a shoe, right? So to disguise their wooden foot. So those types of things become more desirable in prosthetic limbs. And then increasingly, as these limbs become more advanced, and this is what kind of happens around the Civil War and afterwards, that those mechanisms that move pieces of legs and arms become internal to the limbs, right? So there's cords and different types of metal pieces that move the limbs in ways that people can't see them in public. And so the arm, for instance, that I talk about in the paper, which is a remarkable piece in the collection at the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia, had movable fingers, right? And so it was I believe I visited the American Civil War Museum in the spring of 2019 and actually saw this arm. It's on display in their main exhibit. I saw it was almost like a switch on the upper arm of the limb, and I believe what would have happened was that the person would have reached over and moved the switch, and pieces of the arm would have moved. And so it's a really kind of remarkable advancement in these objects. So that's an important piece of the way that limbs kind of changed over the course of the 19th century. And then the other piece, which we kind of touched on earlier, was the development of welfare. So the prosthesis as a component of welfare, that comes directly out of the Civil War. And then the other piece, of course, that we've said is scale. So there's nowhere close to the number of limbs that existed before the war that come after the war. So there's just thousands more people who require these limbs.
Yeah, that's pretty remarkable, especially with the fingers and such. And I'm also having just a wonderful time imagining you at the American Civil War Museum doing a close close look at the object. And I'm sure you were there for not an insignificant amount of time in front of this object, and I'm sure people are going by like, what's this lady doing? What's
I know
going on here?
I was like taking notes and sketching and trying, like, I was like, I don't really care what people think. I'm just gonna close my blinds real quick because the sun is getting to me. One second.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Yeah, that's part of the beauty of being a historian. You sometimes find yourself in these just kind of odd situations, and you just know people are like, "What's that person doing over
I
there?"
know. Yep. And I remember talking to the person in the gift shop and just going on about this arm, and he's looking at me like, "Are you like, but you have this arm and it's out, and I've been looking for it." So, but if you haven't been to the American Civil War Museum, once it opens up, I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful collection, and the peg leg that I talk about in the paper as well is also on display in their main exhibit. So definitely worth the visit.
Yes, wholeheartedly agree. It's a remarkable site that I'd recommend as well. Got an interesting question in the comments from Jenny Lyman, which is kind of along the lines of what we were just talking about. Um, she says, did veterans ever get limbs that were pre-owned, made for someone else, and adapted to someone else? That's, I think, an interesting thought.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I don't know of any specific examples of that. I know, and this is something that I'm sort of interested in looking at in the future, which I haven't spent time doing, but I know existed, which was the actual process of how a veteran went about obtaining their limbs. So I know that there were like they had to be fit for these limbs, right? And there was a
Well,
whole
I was actually just going to ask about that. Like, how custom were these pieces, or was it a more one size fits all?
Yeah, and that that's something off the top of my head I don't think I can explain very well, but I know that they that was a process, right? And I'm trying to remember. Megan Kate Nelson in her book Ruin Nation also has a chapter on the ruins of men, and she talks a lot about amputees and prosthetic limbs. She might talk about that. I'm trying to remember. But yeah, I mean, I think off the top of my head, I don't know the answer, but it is certainly possible where someone who couldn't afford a limb that was custom made, may have come across a limb or and I'm trying to think back into my research whether there were like other objects fashioned as limbs. I might be that I came across like a peg leg that was fashioned out of some other like chair leg or table legs, that sort of thing. That was certainly a possibility. But it's really interesting. I mean, it's really interesting to think about because, you know, that process I don't know how extensive it was, but I know it existed, and so I appreciate that question.
Yeah, that's a great one. Definitely worth looking into in the future. Now, you've touched on this at various points, the importance of having these prosthetic limbs appear natural. And, you mentioned that, how disability or disfigurement was viewed as sort of, a moral failing at times. But even for the wearer, talk about the significance of all this, both for people that aren't the wearer and people that are the wearer, because I think it's a really interesting point that you get into in the article.
Sure. Yeah. So, like I said, the beliefs about morality are really central to how people were perceived as physically different or physically sort of complete in the 19th century. And so, the for a limb to look natural and be a natural replacement, I think several things had to happen. So I've talked a little bit about movement. So a limb that moved like a real limb was really important, and that's we get that example of the movable fingers or the movable toe piece on the National Museum of Civil War Medicine leg are good examples of that. But What I found in my research when I was close looking at the arm at the American Civil War Museum, and reading its the description of it in the collection online, that arm was partially made of molded rawhide, which that was the only limb that I came across that was stated as being made of that material. And that was really fascinating to me, because that quite literally is a material replacement of skin, right? So molded rawhide is animal skin that materially replaced the human skin lost by the wearer, right? And so these limbs quite literally used material that the wearer had lost and replaced them with something comparable. And in this case, it was animal skin. So that was one thing that I hadn't seen talked about in some of the literature that I read. The other thing that, when I was looking at the documentary evidence about prosthetic limbs in the 19th century, the way that they were described, and it's the way that I've been describing it all day, is they were people used terms that we use for bodies to talk about these limbs. So the word joint comes up a lot, right? So the knee joint is something that people used in newspapers to talk about the joint of a prosthetic limb, the actual bolts or mechanism that connected what would have been real joints in the human body. So that's another way that people naturalize these objects. And then in the patent literature that I examined, one of the things I found really fascinating was that the manufacturers, people like Benjamin Palmer, Douglas Bly, who I talk about a little bit in the paper, but they were really well-known prosthetic limb manufacturers. They used the Latin terms for body parts that physicians use to talk about real body parts in their patent literature. So Douglas Bly, for instance, in one of his descriptions of his inventions, and this was, if I remember correctly, this predates the Civil War. So this is like in the 1850s, I think. He describes the cord. There was a cord that internally moved the foot, and he calls it the tendo Achilles, or the Achilles tendon. And so that term shows up a fair amount in that literature. And so, yes, it's about these limbs moving and looking like real body parts, but it's also the way that they're talked about, and it's also the way, like, the actual materials used to construct them. And I think that's just another plug for why material culture is really important, because if you're not thinking about how these objects, like the materials that comprise them and what they look like and how they might feel, you might miss that molded rawhide was used and why that might be significant. And then with the tendo Achilles, right, that's just one way that it's really necessary for material analysis to be combined with documentary analysis, that those two things must work together. It's not one or the other. It's that you can get really rich takeaways from research when you're combining those two types of sources.
Right. And specifically because, in terms of, how it might be appealing for a limb to, appear natural to the wearer, and the significance of some of the materials, this is probably not something they're going to write extensively about. So you get a sense of that by looking at it and by noticing, like you did when you came to the museum. You're noticing, like, oh, this calf muscle is really kind of sculpted. Interesting. So yeah, that's a great point for one of the benefits of what you cite as an object-centered analysis. So I love that. As we're sort of drawing to a close here, you mentioned, we've mentioned this limb that's in the museum's collection. It was found, circa 1950, near a highway, on or near the Monocacy battlefield. And, because it's near a Civil War battlefield, they're like, well, it's probably a Civil War soldier, and it winds up in the collection of the museum. And you spoke to this a little bit previously, but I'm just curious, what sort of lesson does that anecdote have, for a collections policy for a museum like ours? And I'm glad you think it is a worthy addition to the collection. But talk about the kind of interesting I'm not even sure what the right word is, encounters, I guess, or situations you might find yourself if you were a museum collections manager, and how you would approach something like this, because I think it's an interesting little thought exercise.
Sure, yeah. I mean, so I was drawn to this particular leg just because of the images of it. I mean, it's like I said, it's fully intact, and the story behind it. I mean, this man Albert Smith found it while rabbit hunting, and it was like, sounds like from the letter that was written when the family donated it, that it was like sticking out of the riverbank, and the fact that he found it. So well preserved is really remarkable. And so, when I went for my initial visit, I kind of, like I said, had in mind what I wanted to, where I was kind of going with the paper, what I thought I might write about. And it was really this object having it had this story of how it came to the collection, but there was no information about who made it, who designed it, who owned it. Um, and of course that information would have been wonderful to know. I mean, any historian would love the most detailed possible, but that's just not the case. Sometimes that we just can't get all the answers we want. But I think what this article shows is that you can still pull so much rich information from something in a collection that has an unknown origin. And additionally, for the items from the American Civil War Museum that I include in the paper, those do have origins, right? And origin stories attached to them. The pair of crutches, for instance, I talk about, has a nameplate that is of a high-ranking Confederate officer who owned this particular pair of crutches. And I believe the artificial arm, if I remember correctly, belonged to a Confederate veteran who served at Gettysburg, right? So those stories are there, and I include them in the footnotes of the article, but they ultimately weren't necessary for me to make the argument that I eventually crafted, which was about these limbs being natural replacements intended for the wearer. And so I think that there's a lot to be said for, yes, these stories are important, but they're not necessary to tell the histories of these objects, or how these objects contributed or fit into elements or trends of the past. And so I would say for people in collections who have objects that have, they don't know where they came from, they don't know what they are or how they came to be, that's not necessarily a reason. And I guess this would be for historians too, like that's not a reason that to see them as useless, right? For research purposes, is that you can, if you spend enough time with the object, I'm sure you can pull something out of it. And that's certainly something that I learned when I was, spent the 4 hours at the museum.
Yeah, and it's an instructive tale for those people out there. Not suggesting any of you watching necessarily feel this way, but that sometimes can get frustrated with historians to say, why don't you just tell what happened? Just tell a story of the past. I mean, in many ways, we have to be detectives, to really kind of piece together what happened from, a little bit here, a little bit there, a creative reading, a creative look here and there. So I think it's a great example of how you can do rich history, even though the origin of where this object came from is totally unknown. And you have your own theories about where it did or didn't come from, but yeah, you're still able to craft a pretty compelling article, as we've been expounding upon here. So I think that's a great point. Bouncing over the comments, Robert Smith had a question, which is kind of along these lines. Says, wondering if there are specific characteristics of historic limbs that would allow one to determine its period of manufacture, other than the manufacturer name / date, if that happened to be on there. You see them from time to time on eBay labeled, quote, Civil War, but how would a Civil War collector know?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I would say, I think material is important. And so, at least in my research, what I found was that as we get farther along in the 19th century, rubber, for instance, becomes a popular material for the construction of artificial limbs, as opposed to wood, right? So that might be an indicator of, and for me, again, my speculative sort of work on where this leg came from and when it dates from, kind of pointed me in that direction. The fact that it's wood and not rubber tells me it might be earlier than the Civil War. So that's certainly one thing. There were, so many times I really did try to look, can I find this particular limb in patent literature? That was one thing that I really tried to, can I find something that looks like this leg? And I did, I found several examples of patent drawings that looked like the leg, but were made.
And by the way, if people are wondering where that patent literature is, it's and you can correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of it is freely accessible via Google. You just need to do some creative Google searching, but it's it is out there, so you can do some cross-referencing.
For sure, yeah. So there, I found, all this stuff is publicly accessible through the U.S. Patent Office online. If you have a patent number, and actually, I believe it's Hasegawa's book has a really useful appendix in which he includes patent numbers for different models. So I was able to cross-reference those patent numbers with the actual drawings. So that was one way that I tried to find this particular leg. So that would be another thing. Like, can you find a patent number that points you to a date? But it's tough. It's tough to try to pinpoint these, and certainly for collectors, I think it's hard if you're looking at an image online and then someone is saying it's from the Civil War, but you're not 100% sure. I think it's hard to know unless you actually have the object in front of you. But I would encourage. Perhaps looking at some of the literature on prosthetic limbs that we've mentioned today might be a good place to start. You might get a sense of, what manufacturers were manufacturing certain models at certain times, and then be able to sort of find images of those. That might be a good way to try to pinpoint, when the leg was created.
It's all part of the detective work of being a historian, like we were just talking about. Let me see here. Going through the comments. Another one here from Jenny Lyman, thinking about your observation about the difference between reading or hearing about something and seeing, touching, feeling a physical object. Some of us depend on that kind of sensory input to bring us into a subject, the way secondary accounts never do. How can we engage history students more this way without destroying the objects by overhandling? Great question.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think, I was petrified while I was, looking at this object that I would, somehow mess it up, or, I really didn't handle it at all, except for once when we moved it, when I wanted to see a different angle of the leg. But, it's tough. I think you got to walk that fine line of you want, especially students. So I'm thinking as a PhD student, I hope to be teaching one day. And as I think about how I will organize classes and teach classes, objects are so important for learning and sort of passing around and getting people to engage with them is really important. I remember I took a Civil War class in undergrad, and my professor, had Manet balls that he passed around, and that was really useful to sort of think about how these entered people's bodies and did such damage and whatnot. And so, I think that's the battle of sort of the collections managers, right? When they let historians in to touch and hold documents, you run the risk of potentially damaging them. But I think the question is, what are those risks, and how do they weigh up against what can we learn from them? And that's certainly something that, I think I intend objects to continue to be an important part of my research, and, including them and touching them and holding them and being careful with them is all part of that experience.
And another possible way around it, and this involves some extra work, but acquiring reproduction items. At the museum, we have reproduction surgical kits and things of that nature, and that kind of lets lets people really get in there with some hands-on learning, which of course in the time of the pandemic is there's an added challenge there, but yeah, the reproduction stuff is a way to kind of try to skirt the balance. Not quite the same thing as we've sort of spoken about today, but that is one angle there. And there's also some people mentioning in the comments, about asking about closed captions. Sorry, this is an aside here. I believe, and one of my colleagues, Jake, can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that once the video is, we finish up the live stream, when this continues to live online, this will have closed captions available, if that would be helpful. So the Facebook generates them there. So great points in the comments. Appreciate you mentioning that. Let me see here. Well, as we're coming to a close here, Moyra, do you have any sort of final comments about prosthetic limbs? Well, for example, with your article, I like to ask this to authors, because anytime anyone writes anything, it's sort of a labor of love. And now that it's out there and in the world, in the hands of our great members. So for those of you joining late, this article that we've been referencing that Moyra wrote for us appears in our Surgeon's Call journal, which you can get if you become a member of the museum. Comes out twice a year. It's one of the many benefits you get. So if you thought this was interesting, sign up to become a member, and you can gain access to great scholarship like this a little bit sooner than we discussed it. The journal's been out for several weeks now. So anyway, but anyway, when you write something, it's a labor of love. Now it's out there. What's your hope for someone that picks up the article and reads it? What do you hope they get out of it? What do you hope it inspires? What's your hope for the piece?
Well, I love that question. I think, for me, I hope that people have a similar experience that I did, where I came in with, I'm interested in the Civil War. I, enjoy all things Civil War era. But this article really pushed me to think about the 19th century more broadly. And yes, the Civil War is important. But what's happening before is important too, and what happens after is important as well. So I think I hope people see the greater possibilities of looking at 19th century, in this case, limbs, artificial limbs, beyond that Civil War context. I hope they gain that from the article. And then the material culture piece. I mean, I think as I realized the absence of objects in the literature written by historians of the Civil War about prosthetic limbs, it was pretty jarring for me. And that's, there is this sort of beginnings of what historians are calling a material turn in Civil War history. Scholars like Joan Cashin have written about material culture. She's got an edited volume that came out recently on material culture in the Civil War era. So I don't want to say that I'm the only person doing this, because that's not true. But it's beginning, we're starting to see that happen in the Civil War, but I think we need more of it. And we certainly have discussions like discussions of monuments, right? That there are material discussions of Civil War monuments, and that's great, and that's really important. There are discussions of relics, right, that exist well into the post-war period. But I think a greater expansion of the material objects we consider in Civil War history is something that I hope people see, and I hope scholars sort of accept and see as something that's needed, because there's so many objects out there that exist in collections that haven't been analyzed and could really help historians understand different aspects of the war.
Wholeheartedly agree on my end. Well, this has just been delightful, Moyra. I know I've enjoyed it, and I think a number of our viewers, if not all of them, have as well. So thanks so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm glad you enjoyed the article, and I'm glad to hear that people seem to enjoy it out in the world.
Well, wonderful. So if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and sharing the video, helping more people see it. That helps us out a good deal. And if you really enjoyed it, maybe you would consider donating to our fundraising campaign to help alleviate some of the financial losses we've had with COVID. Our goal is $25,000, and we're less than $1,000 away. So just a few more donations, $10 here, $15 here would help us a great deal. There's a link for that in the comments. So thank you so much for watching. I'll be back again tomorrow with Dr. Bill Campbell. We're going to be talking about hospital stewards in the Civil War. Promises to be another excellent conversation. So hope to see all of you back here tomorrow, same time, same place, and have a great rest of your day, everybody.